welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. I'm Kim Menninger, and I am so grateful that you are here. It's now been more than a year since I started this podcast, and I can't tell you how much I've learned and grown from the conversations that we've had here. As you may have heard me share, I have struggled with imposter syndrome and anxiety for much of my life, so this is a very personal journey for me. I do this podcast because I want us to share our stories with each other and to stop suffering in silence. Imposter syndrome is a pretty universal human experience and nothing we should be ashamed of. By listening to or supporting this podcast, you're helping me to advance my mission of destigmatizing this conversation and making it safe for everyone to be vulnerable and get the support they need. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to support this mission even further, please consider subscribing. And if you feel inclined to leave a 5-star review, this really does help raise the visibility of the podcast so that others can find us. And please consider sharing with your friends. Lastly, if you have a story you'd like to share, connect with me anytime. I would be happy to interview you. Thanks again for being here. Welcome, Sophie. I am so excited that we're finally getting this chance to have this conversation in the podcast setting. You and I have had a lot of conversations offline, but I'm very excited to bring this to our podcast listening audience. So before we dive in, I'd love to have you introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit more about you.
Thank you, Kim, and thanks so much for having me. Well, I'm a leader and a former nonprofit executive who coaches leaders, so that's fitting right there, and consults nonprofit organizations and works with individuals who are looking to improve their communication and public speaking skills.
Wonderful. And I know from personal experience, because you and I have been partnering together for a bit now, that you bring really great value to at least the women of our community in terms of building more confidence around their speaking skills, leveraging storytelling, which I think is a missed opportunity for a lot of people. And we're going to get into that a little bit more as we move forward. But I want to start with my standard questions, which are, number one, what does imposter syndrome mean to you? Like, what do you think about, not formal textbook definition, but what does it mean to you? And how, if at all, has it shown up in your life or in your career?
Well, I love that your work centers on this, Kim, because I think it's such a challenge for most leaders, and it shows up in different ways. For me, it showed up as finding there's parts of the work of being a leader that just didn't come naturally at all. And I thought that they should. So it's like that phrase, fake it to make it, that I would sort of do the background work to try to level up, but I wouldn't necessarily be sort of candid or transparent about the ways in which I was getting up to speed. Like they say, building the train while you're driving it. So that's how it's really shown up for me personally, and what the imposter syndrome means. Rather than being more human, which I learned to do over time, to acknowledge that there are things I'm learning. I'm in a growth mindset, and these are my strengths, and you all should know these are my strengths. And there's a reason that as a leader, I've got the financial expertise on our team that I do to do that nitty gritty. And it's because that's not my great strength. And by the way, I have the self-awareness that I need to delegate that so that I can focus on these things and put a spotlight for the team and for myself on the strengths, because it's too easy, I think, to focus on our weaknesses. I think we're wired that way as human beings. You don't want the saber-toothed tiger to come get you. So you take in that wisdom of how you made some missteps and it had some close calls with that tiger, and really focus on getting that right. But forget the fact that you're amazing at cave paintings. And that is where you bring the value to your tribe, is they are just blown away. They're transported by the worlds you can create with paint. But you're thinking, oh, but there was that time that I almost got eaten up. And you're just all about, now you don't want to get eaten up, but as you know, in our day and age, we're not going to get eaten up. We're just at a desk usually. So we can focus on, the better parts of our palette.
Yes, I know. It's funny. What a friend of mine was talking about. She made the distinction between saber-toothed tigers and paper tigers, right? Like, I think that we these days still attach the same level of threat to little things that we would have attached years and years and years ago to the presence of a real predator. But in reality, it's not as threatening as we think it is. And what I love about what you're saying too is, I think one of the unfortunate, I don't know if I'd call it a side effect or an actual manifestation of imposter syndrome, is that we almost create our own prisons, right? Because in many ways, like you're describing, there's no way in which every aspect of leadership is going to come naturally to every leader. There are going to be things that you do better than others. There are going to be things that you outsource, right? Like you said, financial piece or whatever that might look like. And when we come to that honestly, and we have the ability to say, hey, you know what? I specialize over here, and I'm proud of that. And I am also proud of the fact that I recognize that there are people who can do this part of it better than I can. So I'm going to leverage their help. Instead, we're so afraid of revealing that we create these walls and this fear of being vulnerable. And then we deprive ourselves of the opportunity to get the support that we need. And more often than not, everyone around us is going to respect us more for that, right? But we're so afraid that it traps us in these boxes that are really hard to break out of.
Yeah, you make a really important point of the ways in which it's self-created. And because it's self-created, we can't see it, which is why it's tremendous to have a coach. And for those listening, I was blessed to have Kim as my coach in my last leadership role. So I know that she walks the talk here. And I would also add that in the same way we might shine too much of a spotlight on our own weaknesses, we listen too much to those occasional voices that say, like, what? You don't know how to run this super fabulous, amazing financial analysis yet? Somebody might say that, but it becomes magnified. Like, we remember that comment. We just think, oh, that's around the corner. I'm going to be outed that I don't know how to do the blah, blah, blah. I don't have an MBA level, grasp on QuickBooks reports. So I think that's the external voice that, for the most part, people are going to take us as we are, being focused on our strengths. But there are those voices that we have to just tone down and set aside and say, sure, they'll be there. And my eye is on the prize.
Exactly. And one of the big things that's been on my mind lately too is just how a lot of times those voices come from people who are also expressing their own insecurities in, more dominant ways. A lot of times when we struggle with imposter syndrome, we retreat, we shut down, but there are also variations of that are more aggressive and more overcompensating, right? So we're all kind of in this together. We're all just triggering each other, right? And so it is really helpful to try, to the extent possible, as a human who cares about what other people think, to really focus on yourself and what you know to be true for you.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about storytelling, because I know that's central to who you are and the value that you offer. And I'm really curious to hear more about just your story around storytelling.
Sure. Well, the story around storytelling really began as a kid reading books that my parents got for me about adventurers, women who were off in the wilderness, amazing leaders of countries, those little biographies way back when. And it really has evolved over time. And I'm still discovering the ways in which I love story. And I'll say, before I mention what the way story sort of has played itself out in my leadership, I'll say that, through even some of my activities outside of work. And it's something for those of you listening to the podcast to think about, ways your curiosities and your passions show up outside of work and how that links with work. I'll share something you don't know about me yet, Kim, and that is that there was a time where I really explored animals, in particular wild animals in New England, and spent time with some fellow volunteers learning about how to track animals like bobcat and otter and mink, because those are animals that are, they're choosy about their habitat. They won't just live anywhere like the coyote I see now and then in the backyard out here in Stowe, Massachusetts. These animals, they want a nice big space to move in and raise their young and find food. And as I did this, we were supposed to be gathering data, and I was doing my part in gathering data. In other words, looking for tracks and sign that the animals had been here in certain areas west of Boston. But really what I wanted to do was just sit down and hear the stories of our teacher, our tracking mentor. Because she knew the bobcats. When we went up and trained with her in Vermont, she knew the bobcats by name, just by looking at their tracks. She'd say, oh, that's Bobby. He likes to head down this tree line and up into the den.
Wow.
And I thought, this person has, she's reading the landscape like a book. So that is the kind of thing that actually reflected back to me, like, I'm supposed to be gathering data here. I really care about habitat and animals and the natural world, but really what I want to do is just sit down over a cup of coffee and tell stories and hear her stories, mostly listen. So here I am now as a leader, starting 15 years ago in the nonprofit world, realizing that stories are at the heart of everything. The stories of the people that we were serving, the stories of the volunteers, the stories of the board members who got involved in stewarding the organization, and the stories, most of all, of my staff when they came into the office after delivering the programs, the stories they had about the work and the transformations they had created for the people we're serving. And each of us in a work circumstance has that opportunity to listen really deeply for the stories of the change that's happening and the successes and the challenges and the crazy, fumbling, wacky, disaster, full catastrophe days, which have humor and pain all wrapped up into one. So it's listening is the other side of it, I guess, to the story. And so that's what brought me to the coaching work.
Well, and one of the things that I've heard you say that really resonates with me is that when people start to tell a story, people lean in, right? That there's a difference when you're listening to someone tell a personal story than when you're listening to someone give a presentation with data or, just kind of giving a status update on what's going on in the business. And that opportunity for connection is so powerful. But I think when I talk to women and, when I sort of think about the challenges of the community that I want to serve, I think there's so many self-doubts, so many question marks about how do I communicate effectively? How do I show up as a leader? My presence, I'm worried about sounding like I'm serious enough or I want to be respected. And a lot of the focus ends up being on how do I make sure that I dot every I and cross every T, and that I come prepared with every number that I might be asked for. And I just feel like that I'm not judging, because that's a form of preparation that I think does bring a certain amount of confidence. But I also think that it's a missed opportunity in many ways to focus on connection. And I really want to just stop right there and have you pick up from there, because I know that's your sweet spot.
Well, so that's an interesting question, Kim. I mean, you're really asking, how do people show up and listen in the workplace to other people's stories? Is that what you're getting at?
Well, I think that the the fact that we can pretty much say that people are going to be more likely to listen, they're going to listen differently and probably a little bit more, I don't know if emotionally is the right word, but certainly relationally, if you're telling a story than if you're just giving facts. So how do we really start to deprioritize to some extent preparing the facts and focus instead on telling the story?
Mm-hmm. Well, if we're starting from the place that we've got the facts and we're sort of content oriented, we could then say, okay, that's where I know I want to deliver. And we can then look for the stories that are behind that information. Because it's good to be information oriented, especially, with any kind of business, having outcomes, being accountable, needing to reach certain targets. I mean, that's where the data is sort of pointing. So I like to think of it sometimes as like pulling a curtain away from the data and the information and the business and saying, well, who are the people and the experiences that are behind this? And some of that comes from anecdote from people we work with. And some of it comes from just doing a different kind of investigating and talking to colleagues. And some of it comes from exploring within ourselves. So I can give an example of, someone who's trying to share spreadsheets that are pointing to where company is right now. This is a real life scenario. Could think about, well, especially in this time of COVID, where the numbers aren't where we would want them to be, I might say, let me tell you about a story about one of our salespeople who's talking to clients out in the field and having trouble closing sales. Things are falling apart for our clients, just like many people in COVID. And let me tell you about one client. And so here's a trick for those of you listening who want to think about how you tell stories. You can put the story in the present tense. You can say, so here's what I heard from this client. She is a mother with 3 kids, and she's a single mom. And she just launched her business a year ago, not that long before COVID. So she is sorting out how to deal with the fact that she can't get her income to where it needs to be to even just net profit anymore. And she is making phone calls and she is trying to get childcare for the kids. And the kids are running around at her ankles while she is trying to get her income where she needs it to be. So that's a simple example. It doesn't have a lot of color yet. I want to share from that just being in the present tense, and you can bring someone into the story that way and make it real, like in this moment, even if it was a story you heard a month ago. She's sitting there with her kids running around her ankles, asking about lunch, and she is trying to get some more people on the phone, right, and build her income. So that's one way of just thinking of the stories you've heard and considering how to bring them into the present tense and make it real for the listener.
It's so funny because even though I knew you were making that up as you went along, I was like, ooh, I can picture this woman. Like I was in the story as you were telling it, right? And I think that is what makes work real. I think sometimes when we are just running the same report over and over again, looking at the same data over and over again, that's where we get disconnected. We feel like we don't even remember why we're doing it. We don't feel that sense of connectedness to the larger mission, right? There's just sort of this like going through the motions effect that comes when you're just talking about numbers or just talking about facts. And so humanizing the experience is so important, not just to building relationships with other people, but also to just feeling your own sense of connectedness to that environment.
That's right. I'll never forget, Kim, once when I came in the office when I was in an executive leadership role, and I had just had one of those disaster mornings. And for whatever reason, I just decided to share that. I forget the exact details. It doesn't matter. We've all got our own version of a disaster morning, but my son was very young at the time. And I mean, it was just like a miracle that I was at work. You know, those days when you feel like you've already had your biggest win of the day was that you got there and you're not covered in applesauce, right? And you still got your sense of humor intact. And I just shared like more than I would usually share. And my staff loved it. We were all cracking up. They chimed in with their stories of like, you know, oh, I remember a time when, you know, I got in and yep, I left my headlights on, the car would not start. I had this meeting, you know, and I realized whatever, my blouse is inside out. I mean, it was just that, you know, and we're all just like in stitches. And that builds culture, right? And it makes me more real as a leader. Now, I'm not saying you need to go, you know, tell the applesauce on the shirt, you know, kids freaking out version, but you can think about, you know, where it is you've got something, you know, that's just human and universal, and we all can relate to it, to just weave into the conversations or even the presentation, depending on the group that you're talking with.
And I'm curious what your thoughts are, and I certainly have lots of thoughts on this too, but how this ties to confidence.
I love that question. You know, it takes a certain confidence, I think, to share that kind of story. On the one hand, you have to have a little courage, or just feel a little reckless in a good way.
Mm-hmm.
But often it's confidence, right? Feeling confident enough that you won't be judged, right? Or that it's too much to share. And then the irony is that by sharing it, I think it builds confidence, because I put myself forth as more three-dimensional. I'll say within a year of that, I got the idea one day. I was taking music lessons and I had my cello with me at the office, but people didn't know about that. I hadn't even told them I was taking lessons. It was just hidden away in my office. And I got the idea in a staff meeting to pull it out. And I think it was because I had begun to build the confidence that, yeah, I can share these things. I mean, I'm a bit of a gregarious introvert by nature. And so I really mostly want to hear other people's stories, right? And not share that much about myself and talk about the work. It's about the mission and what we're all like in this together as a team, not talk about whatever, you know, I'm doing on my own time. And bringing it out just totally changed. I think it was one more step. I feel like it was this evolution with my staff. And I said, if anyone wants to, so then they said, well, will you, you know, play something? I was like, oh boy. And I said, okay, I'll play a little something, but I was completely a beginner. So I just shared in this really open way because I had this a little bit more confidence, right? That they want to know me, right? It's like what, and then I just shared what I love, which is totally vulnerable. Let me just say. To share with your team, like something that you love outside of work, in this way that's very impassioned. I said, what I love, frankly, is the sound of the bow getting pulled across the cello strings. Like it kind of is the best instrument for me to be a beginner at, because it's beautiful, even if I don't know how to play it yet. I just love pulling that. So I did that a few times. I was like, look at this. And then I pulled it. It just like, that just sounds like Yo-Yo Ma. I mean, look. There's only one, you know, one string, one note. I'm sure it doesn't sound like Yo-Yo Ma pulling one string. And they just cracked up, and we all cracked up, and then they wanted to try it. I was like, and then I like, I mean, we're in a staff meeting. I mean, this is a more casual staff meeting, obviously, where I forget. It was maybe in the holiday season. But the point is, like, it's what's the word? There's something circular about it. I think of it almost as a spiral that moves forward. That confidence is drawing on confidence from other conversations and the willingness of other people to be vulnerable, having role models, right, who told me stories that I loved, and like, who am I to withhold that cello in the closet in my office and not share it? If I can find the confidence to share it, like, that's a way to think about it. I haven't really expressed it this way before, but everyone can think about it this way. It's like withholding and not finding that courage in yourself is actually depriving someone of those stories and of the magic of who you are. And that changed our culture, that like cello moment. We kept referencing it going on, it was like part of the office story, part of the team narrative that, oh, remember that time? Yeah, we were all, this is, playing cello. Yeah, well, we know how to be beginners at things, we've got this. You've got this, right, Sophie? I'm like, yeah, I've got this. It's okay. I haven't done it before. It's going to sound good, everybody. Just pulling that first string.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, because now you have this funny, light way of framing new situations going forward. And yeah, I always think about the connection between confidence and psychological safety, right? And so you're talking about, it starts with a baseline level that I feel safe to be vulnerable with the people around me. So some people don't even have that. I mean, the environment is just so toxic or so unhealthy. But if we set that aside for a moment, I do think this is a self-imposed kind of barrier of I'm afraid of rejection. I'm afraid of what if I take out the cello and people start laughing at me? Or people think, that's so unprofessional. What is she doing playing a cello in a staff meeting, right? Like there's all these things that go through our minds. But I love what you said about sort of tying it to who am I to leave the cello in the closet? Because my philosophy is that no matter what role we play in life, we are here to be of service in some form or another. And there's a lot of different ways to be of service. And part of it is functionally, right? Like I crunch the numbers, I deliver the presentation, whatever the functional nature is of the role. But I also find that there's an act of service in just creating a fun space for people that you work with, or modeling vulnerability, right? Or, just creating a different conversation for people. And that, like you said, it starts with an ounce of confidence, but it really builds confidence by taking that act. Because once you realize, oh, wow, this has like a powerful effect on the people around me, I want to do it even more. And everyone else feels more confident because now they know my leader isn't afraid to be vulnerable. That means I can be vulnerable too. And it has this ripple effect, right? That's the culture piece I think that you're talking about. And so it is an act of service to step into the discomfort. It's an act of service to do the things that scare us.
It is, Kim, that's so beautiful the way you describe that. And what's occurring to me, I'm thinking now about that person, and those of you who are listening and thinking, yep, I'm in that toxic culture. No way I would bring the proverbial cello out of the closet. I'm not even gonna tell them what I'm doing this weekend, like with words, And here's what I would say, consider the stories that inspire you. Maybe there's a TED Talk you listened to recently. Maybe there is even a colleague or someone that you connect with in your community who you hold up as a model in some way of the best of what it is to be fully alive. You can tell a story about them. That's still vulnerable. But if you are in a really toxic environment, you can tie it to the mission. Find the example that's tied with the company's mission so that it's in the guise of the right content. And bring your passion into your love of that person. And I am sure that those of you listening who are picturing that scenario are picking a person who models inclusivity, ability to be vulnerable, the opposite of the circumstances you're in. And that is a sneaky way to work within a culture that is pressing you down. Sure, the cello may be in your closet, but you can talk about something related to the company that says, this I believe, this I hold up as a model. And if it's tied enough with the content, guess what? Two things are happening. One is you're getting to talk about that sort of impassioned, higher purpose quality in yourself without talking about yourself. And then you're also connecting with your purposes as a team and a company. So you're figuring out how to put on display the ways in which you think big and think about the objectives that you're all here for, which also extends your leadership. So it's not an ideal situation, but there are ways to work within it with story and with example. And then maybe someday, either there or somewhere else, you can really share more from your own life.
Yeah. And you know, it always comes down to what's within your control, right? Because you're not going to ever have the power to change how other people react or what the values are of the organization that you're in, but you can make the choice to show up in alignment with your values, right? And I think that too often has a contagious effect, because a lot of times toxic cultures are really just fear. It's fear. Everyone's coming from a place of fear, and it's showing up in really unfortunate ways. And so your willingness to be vulnerable, your willingness to take a courageous step might make somebody else feel a little bit more vulnerable, and it could end up having a domino effect. If not, then you can know at the end of the day, hey, I did everything I can. This is no longer an environment that works for me, and I'm going to go someplace else, right? Yeah, I just think that there's an opportunity to, when we think about some of the fundamental leadership skills, right, around relationship building and inspiring and creating a vision, where storytelling just plugs so nicely into that. And it can be scary, but it can also maybe makes things more fun.
Yeah, so true.
So is there anything that you want to say that we didn't get to yet today in closing? Anything that you want to leave people with?
Well, I would encourage you to look for chances to tell stories. I mean, as you said, Kim, at the outset, people lean in when you say, well, the other day I was talking to a colleague on the phone, and they reported on what their week has been like, or how they've come through this transition. Or you wouldn't even want to use the word reported, but just feel like you can jump into those anecdotes and know that will help people lean in and engage them. And I would also say, you might, if you're interested in including stories and to building your confidence around this and being more of yourself in the workplace, try to listen for those people who do it well and see, like, what is it about them you really admire, if that's not already something you do. Who's out there who makes you lean in? I mean, that's the other side of the coin, right? Who do you love to listen to? And this might be more in I just said the word podcast, or a webinar. And then just think about why. What is it about how they speak? Do they use story? How do they weave in the personal? And what is it that makes you lean in? And sometimes, I love the idea that, there really isn't a big division. So I'm going to go back to my teaching days and make a reflection on reading and writing, which sounds really pedantic, but there isn't really a difference between reading and writing. There isn't really a difference between listening and speaking. In that, what we take in, what we listen to and reflect on becomes what we say. That we are internalizing it. That's just the way we are. So giving yourself the gift of stepping back and saying, why do I just love that person's podcast? Why do I just light up when I hear this TED Talk or this colleague? And think about why, what is it? Why is that? And it doesn't mean that you need to aspire to be just like that colleague, but it may have information there that something is resonating for you. And you can figure out from there, like, what do you just want to experiment with in some little way? In the next conversation you have, in your next one-on-one with your boss or your direct report, what do I want to slip in there and just have a little fun? I used to just have a Post-it. I mean, in these Zoom days, just to remind myself to slip something in and just have that fun little experiment, and it keeps it alive and it lets you try things out without, building out a whole repertoire.
I love that. And it strikes me too that there's an opportunity to listen differently if you're looking for stories, right? Because I think sometimes we aren't fully present, our mind is kind of distracted. So we might miss the story itself. That could be the great story that we want to end up sharing. And so to just be a little bit more observant in the moments that you're in too, and capture that. If you want to make some notes to yourself to remember, oh, I want to tell this story later, or I want to remember the key elements of this, that I would imagine that would be something helpful too.
Yes. Well, and Kim, I think you are a really wonderful listener. I think that's part of your gift as a coach, is the way you listen, and you help others listen to themselves. I always like to say, when I was an executive leader, that really my title should be CLO for Chief Listening Officer. But it's a lifelong journey to become better and better at listening. So I really appreciate that perspective.
Oh, thank you. And thank you so much for having this conversation with me. We're going to put your information in the show notes. So if anybody wants to reach out and continue the conversation with you about how to include stories in your leadership style, or how to tap into this more confidently, you can absolutely reach out to Sophie. And just thanks again. It's always fun to talk to you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you, Kim.
Thanks again for listening. If you'd like to stay connected, please join the Leading Women discussion group, which meets every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. This is a place where women come together to discuss questions or challenges related to leadership development and career management. It's a great place to learn from, support, and connect with other women on similar journeys. In addition to the weekly calls, we also have a Facebook group and a Slack channel where we stay connected and support each other. Please join us there too. You can check out the show notes for the links. Before we wrap up, if you like this podcast, I would love to share another podcast with you that I know you will enjoy. Do you ever find yourself playing small? Do you want to take risks, but in the end, you end up taking the safe route? Does your inner critic keep you from reaching your full potential? As counterintuitive as it often feels, we don't become confident first and then take action. It's through our actions that we build our confidence. That's why one of the greatest ways to manage imposter syndrome is by taking brave and bold action. If you want inspiration and insights to help you to take action and to be brave at work, then my friend and colleague Jen Pastikas's Brave Women at Work podcast is for you. Jen and I met when we interviewed each other for our podcast, and I knew instantly that Jen and I shared a similar worldview and a commitment to empowering women to be our best selves. On her podcast, Jen digs into common challenges such as perfectionism, boundary setting, and burnout, all to empower us to shift our mindsets and play bigger in the workplace. You can find the Brave Women at Work podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. Visit the show notes for the relevant links. Thanks again, and please stay in touch.